Okay, so here we're going to have a look at the thoracic cavity. We see here that the thoracic cavity, as our other body cavities, are going to be lined by a serous membrane. Okay, and so that serous membrane is going to surround all the walls as well as the lungs. Now it's really two serous membranes in that we have one on each side, and then they come together in the middle to form the mediastinum. Okay, so in between those membranes we're going to have what is referred to as a pleural space. Okay, this is a potential space containing a few milliliters of fluid. Okay, this little bit of fluid is going to help keep the lungs attached to the body wall, so that when we expand the thoracic cage, the lungs are going to attach to it and expand as well, creating negative pressure to pull air in so that we have inspiration. There's going to be two main divisions of this pleura. We're going to have the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. Okay, so the parietal pleura is going to have that portion which is along the body wall next to the ribs, and so that's going to be the costal parietal pleura. That portion that is in the middle along the mediastinum is going to be the mediastinal parietal pleura, and then that portion up against the diaphragm is the diaphragmatic parietal pleura. Okay, and the only visceral pleura we see here is on the lungs themselves. Okay, now if we look at the mediastinum, we can divide it up. We're going to see that if we divide it by the cranial aspect of the heart and the caudal aspect of the heart, will give us a cranial, a middle, and a caudal mediastinum. Okay, so in that cranial mediastinum, we're going to find the trachea and the esophagus. We'll find several of the large vessels of the heart. We'll find the vagus nerve, the phrenic nerve, and the recurrent laryngeal nerves. We'll find cranial mediastinal lymph nodes, the end of the thoracic duct, and as we see in this specimen here, we've got some thymus in here. Okay, so this is a young animal. In the middle mediastinum, obviously the heart is there as well as the pericardium. The large vessels at the base of the heart, trachea, and the esophagus continue through this portion, and we find also the vagus and the phrenic nerve. Within our caudal mediastinum, the continuation of the esophagus, we're going to find the aorta, the dorsal and ventral vagal trunks, the caudal mediastinal lymph nodes, primarily in the bovine, and the left phrenic nerve. Okay, in the horse, the mediastinum is perforate, which means mostly on this caudal portion there are very small holes in it so that we have communication between the two sides. Therefore, if we get a pneumothorax, we're going to get collapse of both sides, or if we get a pleuritis, it can spread to the other side. Okay, whereas in the cow it's imperforate, so a pneumothorax will result in just collapse of one side, and also our pleuritis would be contained within that one side generally. Okay, we see on this image here that, okay, so here's our thoracic inlet, which is represented here. On the right side we have this little portion of the pleural space that goes beyond that first rib. That's known as the cupula pleura. Okay, so this is important because if a horse were to run into a post and it were to puncture into that, we could get a pneumothorax, or we could get an infection introduced into that to cause a pleuritis. Okay? So we look here at the horse, we see that the point of the shoulder is generally about adjacent to the first costochondral junction. The point of the elbow about at the fifth costochondral junction. The caudal angle of the scapula out here is generally about the high on the seventh rib. Now this is looking down upon the thoracic cavity. So we have cranial up here, the diaphragm caudally, and we see that down here the pleura coming off the costal region and then reflecting onto the diaphragm doesn't go all the way down through the thoracic cavity. So we have what is known as a line of pleural reflection. Okay. And then we'll notice that the lungs do not extend caudally through that whole pleural space. And so we have the basal border of the lung. And then the diaphragm is going to extend cranially right up adjacent to the apex of the heart. And this is the dome of the diaphragm. Let's take a moment here to add to this. We have the mediastinal pleura here. And if we throw the heart in here, that makes this the pericardial mediastinal pleura. Okay, now the heart has its own visceral cavity, and it's going to have an outer wall. So that's going to be the parietal portion of it. And it's going to have that portion right against the heart itself, which is the visceral part. Okay. So we'll label this the parietal serous pericardium. And so therefore this is the visceral serous pericardium. And there's a connective tissue layer in between these two layers here, which is the fibrous pericardium. So when you first look at the heart in situ, you see this pericardial mediastinal pleura. It's toughed by the fibrous pericardium, and then if you cut through that and look at the shiny inner surface, you see the parietal serous pericardium. And then that shiny surface right up against the heart is the visceral serous pericardium. Okay, if we look at a specimen here and just kind of outline these things, we see that the line of pleural reflection is going to begin at the lower part of the 9th rib, go all the way up to the 18th rib, about the middle of the 18th rib, and then reflect back to the 17th intercostal space. And this I have found, if I separate my fingers about 4 inches and then kind of run that along that costal arch, then that kind of gives me a rough indication of where that's at. Okay, and if we go about the same distance inward from that, we can find the caudal border of the lung. So here are the specific landmarks for that. Low on the 6th rib, about the middle of the 12th rib, and then high in the 16th intercostal space. And then the dome of our diaphragm is going to also start low at the 6th rib, about the middle of the 9th, and notice it is curving more cranially, and then, high in the 15th intercostal space. Now these landmarks are going to be important because if we want to, let's say, do a liver biopsy, the liver is going to be hidden by most of the rib cage within that dome of the diaphragm. And so we may need to do a liver biopsy. If we can, it's good to come out caudal to the line of pleural reflection. But if we still have to go through the pleural cavity, then it's good to be able to make sure we're not going through the lungs as we go in through that pleural cavity, then through the diaphragm to the liver. Okay? So likewise with the bovine, we find the point of the shoulder about the middle of the first rib, point of the elbow at about the 5th costochondral junction. Okay, let's look at those same things. Line of pleural reflection, we're going to see starts low in the 9th rib, reflects up to the middle of the 11th, and then high in the 13th. Caudal border of the lung, we begin low in the 6th, and just kind of a slow sloping line up to the high on the 12th rib. And then our dome of the diaphragm, notice that it's much different in that it's kind of boxy in the front. That's because of the presence of the rumen. So it's low in the 6th up to about the middle of the 6th rib, and then high in the 12th. Okay, so give you those numbers once again. So on the horse, for the dome of the diaphragm, we go 6, 9, and 15. Notice 6 plus 9 equals 15. Okay. Basal border of the lung, 6, 12, and 16. And then line of pleural reflection, low 9, middle 18, and high in the 17, intercostal space. Okay. Likewise in the bovine, we go 6, 6, and 12 for the dome of the diaphragm. We just do a gentle slope from 6 to 12 for the basal border of the lung. And then our line of pleural reflection is low in the 7th, middle of the 11th, and high in the 13th. Okay? Now if we look at the equine lung, we see that it has a very simple lobation pattern. Basically the cardiac notches divide each lung into the cranial and the caudal lobe. Okay, there is an accessory lobe on the right lung. So here's an actual specimen. We can see the cranial and the caudal lobes. And then down here on the more diaphragmatic view, we can see the accessory lobe of the right lung. Okay. In the bovine is going to have a similar lobation pattern to the dog. We see both a cranial and a caudal aspect of the cranial lobe, okay, on both sides. And so this is the cranial lobe over here. We have the middle lobe, and then the caudal lobe, as well as an accessory lobe. Okay, but notice here that cranial right lobe has its own little bronchus coming off, which is known as the tracheal bronchus, sometimes called the accessory bronchus. This is also present in pigs. Okay? And as we'll see in this next image, that the lobulation is also very prominent. So you can actually see the little lobules within the lung here with the interlobular connective tissue. So once again, the cranial and caudal part of the cranial lobe of the left lung, the caudal lobe of the left lung is C, and in this particular specimen we do have some thymus within that cranial mediastinum. Okay, looking at the right side now, this side we can even see that lobulation even more pronounced. So we have a cranial and caudal part of the right cranial lobe. We have a middle lobe, and then we have a caudal lobe. The accessory lobe cannot be seen here as it sits over the heart. We see that the horse heart occupies the 2nd through 6th intercostal space. If we look at the coronary vessels of our heart, the left and the right coronary arteries have equal contribution to the myocardium. So the left gives off the periconal before continuing around caudally as the circumflex branch, and the right comes all the way around the cranial side and then goes down into the subsinuosal interventricular groove as the subsinuosal branch. Okay. There's a brachiocephalic trunk that comes off the aorta. Okay, that brachiocephalic trunk in both the horse and the bovine is going to give off the left and right subclavia, continue as a bicarotid trunk, which then gives off the right and left common carotid arteries. Okay. Now in the horse, very similar to the dog, we're only going to have the right azygous vein, which is going to drain into the cranial vena cava. So we compare that with the bovine. Bovine heart occupies the 2nd through 5th intercostal space. We're going to see that just like in the dog, the left coronary artery contributes to the bulk of the flow, giving off the periconal branch, continuing as circumflex, and then also giving off the subsinuosal branch. Okay? We're going to see that in the bovine, they have both a left and a right azygous vein, the left draining into the right atrium at the coronary sinus. Okay. Also, something that's noteworthy in the bovine is that between the aorta here at 3 and the left and right atrioventricular valves, we're going to see these structures at number 5 here, which are the ossa cordis. So the cardiac skeleton here, this portion of it is going to be ossified. Okay, we don't see that in the young. It becomes more ossified in the older animals. Okay, so that's the os cordis. Okay, let's have a look at a heart here. So we're looking at the right side between the cranial and caudal vena cava. We have a ridge here. This ridge is the intravenous tubercle. Just caudal to that, we have a depression, which is the fossa ovalis. In the fetus, it was the foramen ovale, but then it closes off, becomes the fossa ovalis. If we then go ventrally and just a little more caudally, we have the opening of the coronary sinus. Okay. Then down here at D, between the atrium and the ventricle, we have the right atrioventricular valve. And these tendinous cords that are suspending the valve are the chordae tendineae. And these are attaching to little muscles that look like papilla, so they are known as papillary muscles. Okay. Over here at G, we have some little holes or depressions that kind of look like a dog chewed on it a little bit, so there's been some carnage. This is trabeculae carne. Okay. And then at H, we find these muscle fibers that are actually crossing from the septum out to the outer wall. So I like to think of they're going from the septum to the outer margin of the heart. These are the trabeculae septomarginalis. Okay, these are actually Purkinje fibers helping carry that action potential out to the outer muscle so we get a more coordinated contraction. Okay, so here is a equine heart. We see here the right coronary artery, and it is going to contribute in then to the subsinuosal branch. Okay, so we know that this is an equine heart. Remember, in the bovine heart, it is left. Okay, it has the left azygos, and the left coronary artery supplies both the periconal and the subsinuosal branches. Because this is the right giving rise to the subsinuosal, we know this is an equine heart. Now here I want to show you, this is that same equine heart. I want to show you, there's our coronary groove, And then right there is the coronary sinus. So the great cardiac vein is coming around this caudal aspect of the heart, and it is going to empty into the coronary sinus right about here. And so therefore this groove here is going to be the subsinuosal interventricular groove because it's below the coronary sinus. Okay? Now if we come around here to the left side of the heart, here we see the auricles. Both the auricles are kind of pointing at you, so you know you're on the left side. Here's the right ventricle. Remember, that's not only on the right, but it's cranial, whereas the left ventricle is not only on the left, but it's caudally, and the apex of the heart is on the left ventricle. Okay, so we have the right ventricle narrowing down here as it comes up to the pulmonary trunk. Okay, this narrowing here is known as the conus arteriosus, and since this groove here is adjacent to the conus, it is the periconal interventricular groove. Okay? Now let's take a minute and talk about the punctum maxima. Okay, in the horse, for the pulmonic valve, we want to look low in the left third intercostal space. For the aortic valve, it's going to be high in the left fourth intercostal space. And then for the left atrioventricular valve, it's going to be low in the fifth intercostal space. Okay, so some of you might have learned it as P-A-L, or if you're thinking of the left atrioventricular valve as the mitral valve, then maybe P-A-M. Okay, now the right atrioventricular valve we're going to find on the right side, and it's going to be low in the right third or fourth intercostal space. Okay, let's look at it for the bovine now. Very similar. The pulmonic valve is going to be low in the third intercostal space. For the aortic valve, high in the fourth intercostal space. But here for the left AV valve, it's going to still be in the fourth intercostal space, but it's going to be low. Okay. Then for the right atrioventricular valve, it's going to be low in the third or fourth intercostal space on the right side. So here we're looking at the bovine. We're on the left side. This vein coming in here is going to be the left azygous vein. Okay. We see a nerve coming across here. This is the left vagus nerve. And below that, we're going to find the left phrenic nerve. Okay. Back here at D is the esophagus. Okay, E, we have this glandular tissue here in the cranial mediastinum. Yes, that is the thymus. Okay. So here at F, we've got the aortic arch and the descending aorta. G, we're looking at this great vessel coming off here. Actually, this is going to now be the left subclavian artery, which has come off the brachiocephalic trunk. Its first branch here is going to be the costocervical trunk. Remember, that's going to give off the deep cervical and the first few intercostal vessels. Then we have I going up the neck because it's going to go through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra. It's going to be the vertebral artery. J, which is heading up towards the superficial cervical lymph node, is going to be the superficial cervical artery. K is going to stay inside the thorax here, so that's going to be the internal thoracic artery. And then as we come around that first rib, we're going to continue as the axillary artery. Okay, looking over here on the right side of the bovine, A is going to be the cranial vena cava. B is going to be the caudal vena cava. C, we see here the right azygous vein coming in. Okay, so they have both a left and a right. Now here at D, I'm showing the structure right in here. This is going to be the tracheal bronchus going into the right cranial lobe of the lung. Here we see at E the esophagus. Ventral to E we have a nerve which is the ventral vagal trunk, and so dorsal to E is going to be the dorsal vagal trunk. Now at H we find a lymph node here. Okay, this is a very important lymph node in the bovine. This is the caudal mediastinal lymph node. When it becomes inflamed, it can impinge upon this dorsal vagal trunk, cause problems with the parasympathetic to the digestive tract, and we have that as vagal indigestion. Not to be confused with eating a 99-cent dinner in Las Vegas and getting a stomach ache, which is also vagal indigestion. Okay, a little bit of humor there. Okay, here's just a close-up look. We can see both the middle and the caudal mediastinal lymph node in the bovine. We see the dorsal vagal trunk above the esophagus there. If we get a respiratory infection and those become inflamed, they can impinge upon that dorsal vagal trunk. Okay, a close-up look here. We've got here at A is going to be the brachiocephalic trunk. From that we have the right subclavian artery, giving off once again our costocervical trunk. And then following that we have our vertebral artery. E going up towards the superficial cervical lymph nodes is the superficial cervical artery. F staying within the thorax is going to be the internal thoracic artery. And then once again coming around the first rib is the axillary artery. Okay, so H then continuing cranial is going to be our bicarotid trunk, which here we can see coming off of that the right common carotid artery, so it'll also give off the left common carotid. Okay, running with that common carotid artery is a nerve, and we can see that nerve continuing this way, out that way. So that's going to be the vagosympathetic trunk. And right here it's giving off a branch which comes around that subclavia, and that's going to be the right recurrent laryngeal nerve. Okay. Now here's a section from a horse. Once again, A is going to be the phrenic nerve. B is going to be the vagus nerve. And so our vagus nerve is going to come along here, and it's going to continue on up this way, and it's going to give off this branch C, which is the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. Okay, this structure at the arrow that C is then going around is a structure that goes between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay, in the fetus it is known as the ductus arteriosus, but then it closes off and becomes known as the ligamentum arteriosum. Okay, and so D, we find some lymph nodes here that can impinge upon this recurrent laryngeal nerve. Okay, so young animal gets respiratory infection, these get inflamed, could impinge upon this. This is one of the theories for resulting laryngeal hemiplegia in the horse because of damage to the left recurrent laryngeal nerve. So these are the tracheobronchial lymph nodes. Okay, let's look at the caudal mediastinum in the horse. Here we see the aorta. Up here at B is the right azygous vein. Between those two, we might be able to see the thoracic duct. Okay. Up here, closer to the vertebra, we have the sympathetic trunk at D. And so at E, we now once again have the dorsal vagal trunk overlying the esophagus and then the ventral vagal trunk. Okay, and that's all I got for you.